The morning Cecilia Voss loaded the first wagon, the fog was still thick on the ridge, and the town could not quite see what she was doing. That was, in all likelihood, the last time it would fail to notice her. She moved through the gray like a woman with a private calendar, her boots finding the path between the barn and the road without hesitation, her hands gripping the wooden slat sides of the wagon with the casual authority of someone who had gripped them 1,000 mornings and expected to grip them 1,000 more. Beside her, nodded into the shadows at the barn door, stood her youngest nephew Jasper, 11 years old, and already quiet in the way that certain children are quiet, not from shyness, but from an excess of attention. He watched her the way a dog watches a person pack a bag, with the whole body, sensing not just the movement but the intention behind it. And in the wagon, cradled in straw and packed against one another in rows, were the jugs. Cracked stoneware, most of them. Salt-glazed and gray-blue, some with the ghost of a maker's mark still visible on the shoulder, some missing handles, some with hairline fractures that caught the low morning light like rivers on a map. Ugly things, a townsperson would say. Broken things. What would a woman want with a wagon of broken jugs? That is the question this story sets out to answer. It will take several years to answer it properly, and by the end, the answering will cost certain people in Harnett County, North Carolina, considerable pride, and one very prominent man his self-assurance for the rest of his natural life. But we begin here, in the fog, with Cecilia Voss and her wagon of cracked stoneware, because what a person chooses before witnesses arrive tells you nearly everything about who that person is. She had already gathered 43 jugs by that morning in the autumn of 1911. She would gather 61 more before the cold settled in. She paid for them in coin when people had them to sell, and in labor or preserved goods when they did not. A cracked jug with a stable crack, she explained to no one who did not ask, was not the same as a broken jug. A crack that has been there 30 years has already done its moving. She did not say this often. She said it twice to two different people, and then she did not say it again, because the town had already formed its opinion, and opinions, once formed in a county like that one, move at approximately the pace of exposed granite. The opinion was this. Cecilia Voss, 41 years old, widowed 3 years prior, educated to a degree that made certain people uncomfortable, had lost her bearing. She had inherited the small Voss pottery works from her husband, Edward, who had inherited it from his father, who had built the stone kiln himself in 1867 with a technique he had carried in his memory from the western counties of Germany. The kiln still stood. The pottery works still stood. Cecilia still employed 4 men, still fired pieces on the old schedule, still kept the books with the precision that had made her the actual mind behind the works for most of her marriage, though this last fact was not something Harnett County chose to hold in focus. What the county held in focus was the jugs, and the question, and the feeling, which is a particular kind of cruelty that small places visit on solitary women, that someone ought to really have a word with her. The refrain she had lived by since she found her grandmother's record books in the crawl space of the works, 3 months after Edward's funeral, was plain enough to carve on a gatepost. She read it the first time in her grandmother Polly Voss's hand, written in pencil at the top of a page dated April 1883, and it went like this. The clay keeps what the fire could not take from it. She did not know, reading it for the first time that November afternoon with the record books open on the works table, and the smell of old paper mixing with the smell of iron and glaze powder, whether her grandmother had meant it as poetry or instruction. She came to understand, over the following months of reading, that Polly Voss had not distinguished between the two. The record books were not diaries. They were technical accounts, systematic and dense, full of firing temperatures noted in handwriting so small it required a glass to read, full of observations about which local clay bodies cracked on the wheel and which did not, which glazes ran in high heat and which held their ground, which structural failures could be predicted and which arrived without warning. But threaded through the technical record, in the margins and at the tops of pages and sometimes mid-entry, were the observations of a woman who had spent 40 years watching the material behave and had formed conclusions about its character that went well beyond chemistry. Polly Voss had believed and had written plainly that a stoneware vessel that survived its initial firing and cracked afterward, in use or in storage, had not failed. It had demonstrated. It had shown under real conditions exactly the nature of the clay body and the glaze and the bond between them. A crack was information. A stable crack, one that had widened and then ceased, was finished information. Complete. You could read it like a sentence. Cecilia read those books 4 times that winter. She read them again in the spring. By summer, she had begun cross-referencing Polly's firing notes against the county agricultural extension bulletins and against 2 books she ordered at some expense from a university library in Chapel Hill. And by autumn, she had the outline of a plan that she did not discuss with anyone, because the plan required time to become visible, and because she knew that in the interval it would be dismissed as grief. She was not grieving. She had grieved Edward sincerely and completely in the first year, with the disciplined interiority of a person who understands that grief is a form of accounting that must be done honestly, or not at all. She was, by the autumn of 1911, simply working. The clay keeps what the fire could not take from it. She had come to read that line as a kind of technical promise, and she intended to collect the evidence. The first person to formally register an objection was Aldous Crane, who was at that time president of the Harnett County Merchants and Growers Association, a title which meant in practice that he was the loudest voice in the room at meetings that mattered, and the first person consulted when someone in the county was thought to be behaving in a manner that reflected poorly on the general enterprise of commerce. Crane was not a cruel man. He was the more dangerous species, a certain man, and his certainty had the warmth and finish of good furniture, so that you could sit comfortably in it without noticing it was not your own. He arrived at the Pottery Works on a Tuesday in late October, driving his own buggy, which he rarely did, and which signaled that he considered the visit private rather than official, a distinction he made without realizing that Cecilia found private condescension considerably harder to forgive than the public kind. He stood at the edge of the works yard and looked at the stacked jugs, which by then numbered close to 70 and occupied a full quarter of the covered storage area in an arrangement Cecilia had ordered with geometric care. He looked at them for a moment. He said, "Cecilia, I have to be honest with you, because I consider myself a friend of this family going back to your father-in-law's time, and a friend speaks plainly. These are cracked jugs. They are worth nothing at market. Whatever you paid for them, you paid too much, and whatever you intend to do with them, I urge you strongly to reconsider." She was at the wheel when he said this, her hands in clay, working the collar of a vessel she did not intend to stop working. She said, "I know what they're worth at market." He waited for more. There was not more. He said several additional sentences about prudent management of inherited assets and the wisdom of consulting with people who had broader commercial experience, and she listened to each sentence with the same expression she wore for most conversations, which was not quite patient and not quite distant, but resided in the narrow space between, the expression of a person who is receiving information she already has. When he finished, she thanked him for coming. He left. Jasper, sitting on the fence post at the corner of the yard, watched the buggy until it was out of sight and then looked back at his aunt. She was already working the clay again. Aldous Crane was the first but not the last. Over the winter and into the spring of 1912, Cecilia received a procession of visitors whose function, though they would not have named it this way, was to reflect the town's bewilderment back at her in hopes that it might prompt a correction. There was Dr. Pell, who was a kindly man and who brought a jar of his wife's apple preserves and who sat at her kitchen table for 40 minutes, explaining that grief expressed itself in unexpected ways and that there was no shame in having a period of confused priorities after a loss, and that he could recommend several practical steps toward re-establishing a sense of normalcy. Cecilia accepted the preserves, offered him coffee, and asked whether he had ever read anything on the thermal properties of salt glaze at varying peak temperatures. He had not. She did not press the point. She thanked him. He left confused and more worried than he arrived, which was his own doing. There was also Harriet Belshore, whose husband owned the largest timber operation in 3 counties and who stopped by in a carriage that was conspicuously well appointed for a casual call, and who looked at the growing rows of jugs with the particular expression of a person who considers aesthetic displeasure a moral position. Harriet said that she admired Cecilia's independence enormously and that she had always felt the Voss Pottery Works had such potential if it were brought more current, and that she knew several people in Raleigh who had expressed interest in acquiring established regional pottery concerns, people with capital and ideas, and that she would be glad to facilitate an introduction if Cecilia found herself open to a conversation about options. Cecilia said she was not open to a conversation about options. Harriet smiled in the way that people smile when they have decided that the problem is sadder than they originally estimated, and she left, and Cecilia returned to the storage room and spent the rest of the afternoon cataloging the glaze characteristics of the most recently acquired jugs against Polly Voss's recorded observations, and found 3 matches that she noted in her own journal in pencil, quietly pleased in the way that a person is pleased when a theory begins to find its evidence. The one who came closest to seeing the plan for what it was arrived in March of 1912, when the dogwoods were just beginning and the storage area now held 114 jugs in their careful rows. His name was Titus Malone, and he was 26 years old and had been apprenticed to the work since he was 16 and had the particular gift of a person who understands materials from the inside out, not through books, but through hands and years and an instinct that resists reduction to language. He had watched Cecilia accumulating the jugs with the attention he brought to most things, which was total and undemonstrative. And one morning when they were alone in the storage room, he looked at the rows for a long time and then said, "You're mapping something." She looked at him. She said, "Yes." He said, "Polly's records." She said, "Yes." He said, "What are you building?" She said, "A library of what holds." He did not ask another question. He began from that day to assist with the acquisition and cataloging without being asked to do so, arriving early on the mornings she drove to outlying farms, lifting and packing with efficiency, and contributing his own observations about individual pieces in the same sparse notation she used in her journal. Between them developed the grammar of people who communicate primarily through shared work, which is a grammar with very few words and a great deal of precision. Jasper watched this and said nothing, but his expression shifted from watchful to something more settled, as if a concern he had not quite articulated to himself had been addressed. The middle years resist the drama that makes for easy telling, but they contain everything that matters, and so we must spend time in them honestly. Between the spring of 1912 and the late summer of 1914, Cecilia Voss did the following. She continued acquiring cracked stoneware, ultimately accumulating 207 individual pieces of varying age, provenance, and clay body composition. She cross-referenced every piece against Polly's records and against her own growing system of notation, identifying in the process 11 distinct clay body types sourced from 9 counties, with corresponding glaze formulations and structural tendencies that were, she determined with increasing confidence, not randomly distributed. They clustered. The best-performing clay bodies, those whose cracked survivors demonstrated the most stable, the most predictable, the most technically legible failure modes, came from 5 specific source areas within a 20-mile radius of Harnett County. 2 of those source areas were still accessible. One was on land she owned. She began in 1913 to test production clay bodies against the evidence of the old jugs, running small experimental batches, documenting results with Polly's methodical thoroughness and her own additional precision. She identified a formulation, a specific blend of local clay bodies with a particular firing progression, that produced ware of exceptional structural consistency, ware that demonstrated under stress not the sudden catastrophic failure of a weakly bonded piece, but the slow, informative, stable response of a material that knows what it is made of. She fired 30 test pieces. She broke 20 of them deliberately and documented every fracture. The remaining 10 she fired again at the top of the kiln's range and broke those as well. The evidence was, in her private journal, unambiguous. Meanwhile, Aldous Crane had invested in a new pottery concern across the county line, a larger operation with a mechanical jigger wheel imported from Ohio, and a young manager from Charlotte who spoke confidently about market trends and had written a proposal full of numbers that Crane found persuasive because they were the kind of numbers that fill a room. The new operation produced ware quickly and in quantity. It sold well in the first season. Crane mentioned it to several people at the association meetings with a satisfaction that contained, just barely, a secondary satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who feels that events are arranging themselves into a lesson that someone nearby needs to learn. What neither Crane nor the young manager from Charlotte had documented with any care was the clay body they were using, which had been selected primarily for availability and cost, and which Polly Voss had noted in her records in 1891 as locally quarried material of inconsistent character, prone to microfracturing under thermal stress that would not be visible in the piece at point of sale. She had written, "Sells well until it doesn't." That was the complete notation. Cecilia had read it. She had placed a small mark beside it in her own pencil. She had not mentioned it to anyone. The summer of 1914 arrived in Harnett County with the particular intensity of a summer that has been preceded by 2 wet years and intends to make a point. The drought came in June and it did not leave. By July, the soil was the color and texture of fired brick in the fields, and the creek that ran behind the Voss Pottery Works had retreated to a thread. By August, the merchants were meeting twice a week and the conversation had grown a new register, no longer the ordinary complaint of seasonal inconvenience, but the lower, more serious frequency of people who are beginning to understand that they are dealing with something structural. The pottery works ran from a spring that Cecilia had maintained with a care that had prompted several observations over the years about the amount of attention she gave to a muddy hole in a hillside, and the spring held. Quietly and without fanfare, it held because she had cleared its channel and lined its basin and maintained its flow path for 3 consecutive years, while everyone else had been managing their water situationally, as one manages things one does not believe will become critical. The kiln she had been firing in the experimental runs maintained consistent temperature because the fuel she had been stockpiling, accumulated across 18 months in a storage arrangement that Titus had helped her engineer against the hill behind the works, had been dried and stacked with an attention to moisture content that produced predictable, even combustion. The new concern across the county line had been sourcing fuel as needed, which had seemed efficient, and in a drought year with roads hardening and carters raising their rates and schedules becoming unreliable, it seemed considerably less efficient in retrospect. In August, a buyer arrived. This requires a brief explanation of the context, because the buyer did not arrive by accident and because the mechanism of his arrival is the load-bearing hinge of what followed. His name was Samuel Greer, and he represented a commercial concern based in Philadelphia that supplied institutional kitchens, large establishments, hotels and hospitals and dining operations that purchased stoneware in quantity and had grown, in recent years, increasingly frustrated with the inconsistency of regional production. Greer had been traveling the southeastern states for 6 weeks, stopping at pottery works with a specific set of requirements, and had found in 6 weeks nothing that met them. His requirements were not complicated. He needed ware that did not fail unpredictably. He needed a clay body whose behavior under thermal stress was documented and consistent. He needed someone who could tell him, from evidence rather than assurance, why their product held. He had stopped at 6 operations, and at each one he had received assurances. He had not received evidence. He was tired, and he was specific, which is a combination that makes a person formidable. He stopped at the Voss Pottery Works because someone in a county seat 50 miles south had mentioned, without particular enthusiasm and with a faint air of puzzlement, that the woman at the Voss Works had been accumulating cracked old jugs and keeping some kind of records about them, and Greer, who was a man accustomed to recognizing the shape of a system even when others saw only the surface behavior, had written down the name and the county and driven out of his way to find it. He stood in the storage room for a long time. The jugs were arranged in their rows, catalogued with small paper tags that bore Cecilia's notation system, and beside them on the long work table were the journals, Polly's and Cecilia's own, open at the relevant entries because Cecilia had known, with the practical intelligence of a person who understands that preparation is respect, that whoever came looking for this kind of evidence would want to see it in person. Greer moved along the rows slowly. He picked up a piece, read its tag, set it down. He opened a journal and read. He asked 2 questions. She answered them in 1 sentence each. He was quiet for a while. He said, "How many pieces can you produce in a year at this standard?" She said, 400 in the first year, more as we expand. He said, "I would like to see the firing records." She said, "They are on the table." He read the firing records. He was there for 3 hours. He left with a letter of intent in his breast pocket and a price schedule that Cecilia had prepared 6 weeks earlier in the same pencil she used for everything because she had expected someone like him to come. She had not known his name or his city, but she had known his requirement because his requirement was identical to the one she had been answering for 3 years in the privacy of her own journal. The clay keeps what the fire could not take from it. Titus Malone, who had been working at the wheel the entire time and had watched without appearing to watch, came into the storage room after Greer drove away. He looked at the table and the journals and the letter of intent that Cecilia had left open under a small piece of biscuit-fired stoneware. He said, "Well," she said, "we'll need 2 more hands by October." He said, "I know 2 people." She said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. Jasper, who was now 14 and had spent enough time in that storage room to have memorized the catalog by feel, heard this exchange from the doorway and went back out to the yard and sat on the fence post in the August heat and felt something that he would not have been able to name at 14, but that was, in retrospect, the specific satisfaction of watching a long and patient thing arrive at its moment. The account of Aldous Crane in that autumn is not a comfortable one to render, and it will be rendered without comfort because the discomfort is, in fact, the point. The pottery concern he had invested in had, by September, produced its first round of institutional complaints. Ware that had been purchased by a hotel supply house in Greensboro was failing at the glaze interface, not catastrophically, not all at once, but in the gradual and demoralizing way of a material whose weaknesses are constitutional rather than incidental. The young manager from Charlotte had explanations, reasonable sounding and detailed, and Crane had listened to them with the attention of a man who needs to believe the explanations and has practiced believing things that are convenient. By October, when the second round of complaints arrived and the hotel supply house declined to renew and the jigger wheel from Ohio required a repair for which the part had to come from Cincinnati, Crane had begun to understand that something in the original accounting had been wrong and that the wrongness was not incidental to the investment but structural, baked in, visible in retrospect in ways that would have required a particular kind of attention to see in advance. He drove out to the Voss Pottery Works on a Wednesday in November, alone in his buggy, and the works was not quiet. There were 2 new hands in addition to Titus, and there was smoke from the kiln, and there were more jugs in the storage room, not cracked ones but finished ones, good ones, made to the standard that the journals documented and that Samuel Greer's letter of intent required. Cecilia was at the accounts table when he came in, and she looked up once and then returned to the accounts. And Crane stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he did not expect and is still constructing the sentence for why he came. He said, "I owe you an honest conversation." She said, "Sit down." He sat. He was a big man, and he sat in the chair by the table like a man who has recently lost some weight he did not intend to lose. He said that he had been watching the concern across the county line with some concern of his own, and that certain developments had given him reason to reconsider certain assessments he had made at various points, and that he had perhaps been less than properly attentive to the basis on which you, he said, had been working. He said this carefully, and it cost him something to say it. You could see the cost in the deliberate pace of the words, each one placed like a foot on uncertain ground. She waited until he was finished. She said, "The clay records go back to 1871. They were in the works the whole time." He said, I didn't know about the records. She said, no. He said, is there anything I can do? She thought about this for a moment. She said, yes. She said that she needed a reliable arrangement with the county road authority to ensure access on the south track for her delivery cart through the winter, and that Crane's position with the association made him the person best placed to secure it. She said that in exchange, she would be glad to share the firing records with anyone in the county who had a pottery operation and wanted to improve their clay body selection, freely, without charge. He looked at her. He said, freely. She said, the records aren't mine to sell. They were my husband's grandmother's. He said nothing for a moment. He said, I'll speak to the road authority this week. She nodded. He left. She returned to the accounts. The South Track arrangement was in place by December, and the firing records, copied in Titus Malone's careful hand on good paper, were distributed to 3 other pottery operations in the county before the year was out. Samuel Greer's first order was fulfilled in February of 1915, 412 pieces of stoneware, shipped north in crates packed with the care of a woman who considered a broken piece in transit a form of inaccuracy. Not one piece arrived cracked. The institutional client that received them noted in their correspondence that the ware performed with a consistency they had not previously encountered in regional production and inquired about the following year's capacity. Cecilia Voss replied to this inquiry in her own hand, briefly and specifically, with the production numbers for the coming year and the price schedule for bulk orders, and she filed the correspondence in the journal beside Polly's records as documentation. The works expanded twice in the following decade, once in 1917 and once in 1921. Titus Malone became the works manager and remained so for 30 years. Jasper, who had sat on the fence post and watched the first wagon in the fog, studied materials chemistry at the university in Chapel Hill, and returned to Harnett County in 1924 to establish the county's first technical ceramic library, a collection of fired test specimens with accompanying documentation that Cecilia had been building since 1912, and that Jasper, with the instinct of a person shaped by a particular education, recognized immediately as the most significant material archive in the region. The library occupied a room at the Pottery Works. It was not famous. It was used, which Cecilia considered a better outcome. She worked until she was 73. She died in 1943 in November, in the same county where she had lived her whole life, and she was buried in the churchyard where the Voss family markers go back to the 1870s. Her own marker is a plain slab of local granite, and on it the only words beyond her name and dates are the ones that Jasper chose, because she had left the choosing to him and because he remembered everything. They are the words she had read the first time in pencil in her grandmother-in-law's hand, on a page dated April 1883. The words she had lived by for 30 years of quiet, patient, evidence-gathering work. The words that were, in the end, not poetry or instruction, but both at once, exactly as Polly Voss had intended. The stone reads, "The clay keeps what the fire could not take from it." And in Harnett County, if you know where to look, you can still find the jugs in their careful rows in the room that Jasper built. Each one tagged in pencil with its origins and its story, each crack a finished sentence in a language that takes patience to learn. Patient people still go there to read them.